January 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing. From the Baltic coast to the Vistula River, the Red Army was advancing like an unstoppable storm, devouring everything in its path. For millions of German civilians trapped in East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Courland pocket, there was nowhere left to run, except to the sea. The roads were frozen, choked with snow and bodies. Endless columns of refugees moved westward. Old men, women, children, pushing carts, pulling sleds, carrying what little they could. Behind them, the thunder of Soviet artillery grew louder by the hour. Soviet tanks were closing in on Königsberg, their tracks grinding through abandoned villages, their gunfire echoing through forests that had once been quiet. The Baltic Sea, cold and grey, became their only hope. It was here that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy, decided to attempt the impossible: the evacuation of all civilians, soldiers, and wounded men from the eastern provinces. He called it Operation Hannibal. No one knew then that it would become the largest sea evacuation in human history, greater even than Dunkirk. Over 800 vessels, warships, ferries, merchant ships, fishing boats, and luxury liners converted into troop transports would sail under constant threat of Soviet submarines and air raids. Between January and May 1945, they would carry more than 2 million people to the west, but the cost would be measured in fire, ice, and tragedy. At the heart of this exodus stood one ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, once a proud cruise liner of the Nazi leisure organisation Kraft durch Freude, now transformed into a floating fortress of refugees. She was designed for 1,900 passengers. When she sailed, she carried over 10,000 souls. The port of Gotenhafen, today's Gdynia, was chaos. Refugees crowded the docks, desperate to board anything that floated. Mothers handed babies up through windows. Soldiers shoved the wounded on stretchers across frozen gangways. The cold cut through everything. The sea itself seemed made of glass and iron. Soviet bombers circled overhead, and the black holes of submarines waited beneath the surface. The Wilhelm Gustloff's captain, Friedrich Petersen, faced an impossible choice. The ship was overloaded, the weather brutal, and the escorts few. But delay meant death. The Red Army was just days away. At dusk on January 30th, 1945, the ship finally slipped its moorings and crept out into the dark Baltic, escorted by a single torpedo boat. Snow fell thick and heavy. The decks were crowded shoulder to shoulder with soldiers and civilians. Children cried in the freezing wind. Below deck, the air was suffocating. Bodies pressed together, the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. A few men sang softly, trying to drown out the sound of the engines and the distant rumble of war. In the radio room, operators struggled to maintain contact with other evacuation ships. Static hissed in their headphones. Somewhere out there, Soviet submarines hunted. In the dark sea ahead, the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, was prowling. His orders were simple: sink any German ship attempting to flee. He could not have known that among the targets that night was not a convoy of soldiers, but a ship full of civilians: women, children, nurses, and wounded men. By midnight, the Wilhelm Gustloff had passed the Stolper Bank, moving slowly through the frozen sea. Her lights were dimmed, but not dark. Against the captain's protests, the convoy had illuminated navigation lamps to avoid collision, a fatal mistake. Far below, in the darkness of the Baltic, Marinesko saw the faint glow. Through the periscope, the massive shape of the liner filled his vision. He whispered a command. The torpedo tubes flooded. The crew held their breath. 3 white streaks left the submarine, each carrying hundreds of lives in its path. At 9:16 p.m, the first torpedo hit. A second followed seconds later. The third struck amidships. The sound was deafening, a dull, crushing roar that split the ship open like paper. The lights went out. Panic erupted. On the freezing decks, the screams began. The Wilhelm Gustloff was dying. The first explosion tore through the hull like a hammer hitting glass. The Wilhelm Gustloff shuddered violently, lights flickering as steel screamed and twisted. For a moment, no one moved, just a stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Below decks, in the lower compartments filled with wounded soldiers and civilians, the torpedoes had hit directly. Water poured in with a roar, flooding the corridors in seconds. Mothers clutched their children, trying to reach the stairwells. Men shoved and shouted. The air filled with smoke, steam, and the sharp smell of oil. On the upper decks, the cold hit like a wall. The temperature outside was -10 degrees Celsius, and the Baltic wind cut through clothing like knives. The ship listed sharply to port, throwing people against the rails. Lifeboats, frozen to their davits, refused to budge. Crewmen hacked at ropes with axes while terrified passengers crowded around, begging to be saved. At 9:20 p.m., the second torpedo struck near the swimming pool area, where hundreds of young naval auxiliaries, mostly teenage girls of the Marine Helferinnen, had been quartered. The blast wiped out the entire section. Survivors who stumbled out of the smoke found only mangled steel and silence. From the submarine S-13, Captain Marinesco watched through his periscope as the German liner began to list heavily. He could hear the faint rumble of explosions even underwater. His crew cheered. They thought they had struck a major troop transport. No one on that submarine could imagine that they had just sent thousands of civilians to their deaths. On board the Gustloff, panic became madness. The decks were a blur of shouting, pushing, and collapsing bodies. The ship was tilting so steeply that some tried to climb railings to stay upright. The Black Sea below was full of wreckage and people. Dozens had already jumped, their screams carried away by the wind. A young sailor tried to lower a lifeboat packed with children. The rope snapped, dropping everyone into the freezing water below. They vanished in seconds. The water temperature was just above freezing. Survival time was measured in minutes. Inside the ship, corridors became rivers. Refugees banged on locked doors, trapped in cabins that were now underwater. Some prayed. Others screamed for their mothers, for God, for help that would never come. The wireless operators sent desperate SOS signals. SOS, SOS, Wilhelm Gustloff torpedoed, position 55 degrees 7 minutes north, 17 degrees 41 minutes east, sinking fast. The message crackled across the Baltic, but few ships could respond. Many German vessels were already overloaded with refugees or under orders to stay away because of submarine threats. As the ship continued to list, Captain Peterson gave the order to abandon ship, but it was already too late. Only a handful of lifeboats could be launched. Most were either destroyed by the blasts or frozen in place. One witness, a young nurse named Greta Richter, later recalled how she climbed onto the icy rail and looked down at the sea. Black, endless, filled with people crying out. There was no choice, she said. We jumped. The cold hit like knives. My breath froze. I tried to swim, but my clothes pulled me under within 20 minutes. The Wilhelm Gustloff was nearly on her side. The lights flickered once, then went out completely. The ship's enormous hull groaned as bulkheads gave way. The last sound many heard was the deep, mournful roar of the ship's horn, a single haunting note that echoed across the sea. Then at 9:40 p.m., the ship rolled and began to sink stern first into the darkness. Thousands still remained inside, trapped. Witnesses from nearby ships saw the glow of lights vanish beneath the waves, followed by an eerie silence. The Baltic swallowed them whole. Out on the water, The survivors floated in small clusters, clinging to debris. Some sang hymns to keep from screaming. Others drifted quietly, too numb to speak. The cries grew weaker as the cold claimed them one by one. Rescue ships began to arrive almost an hour later. German torpedo boats Low, TF-19, and several smaller vessels braved the icy waters, their searchlights sweeping the darkness. They found hundreds of bodies, frozen stiff, drifting like statues. The lucky few pulled aboard were half dead from hypothermia. Out of more than 10,000 souls aboard, fewer than 1,200 would survive the night. The rest, over 9,000 men, women, and children, vanished into the icy depths of the Baltic. The scale of the loss was unimaginable, greater than the Titanic and Lusitania combined, yet it happened in the shadows of a collapsing war, almost unnoticed by the world. The sea that night became a graveyard stretching for miles. At dawn, the frozen horizon glowed red as the sun rose over the Baltic. Pieces of wood, life jackets, children's toys, and lifeboat fragments floated in the still water. A single seagull circled above, the only sound in an ocean of silence. For those who survived, the memories would never fade. The smell of oil, the screams, the cold. The moment the lights went out, the Wilhelm Gustloff was gone. But Operation Hannibal was far from over. Hundreds of other ships were still crossing the Baltic, and many of them would share her fate. The morning after the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the Baltic Sea lay quiet, but it was a silence haunted by death. The horizon shimmered pale grey, waves lapping softly against thousands of lifeless forms drifting in the icy water. The evacuation convoys still moved west, slow and frightened, their engines echoing across the endless white mist. For those commanding the operation, there was no time to mourn. In Gotenhafen, Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered the mission to continue at all costs. The Red Army was closing in on the Baltic ports. Every hour meant another train of refugees arriving from the east, another crowd begging to escape before the front collapsed. The docks were filled with cries, curses, and the distant rumble of artillery. Ships left one after another, freighters, fishing trawlers, hospital ships, each overloaded with people. They sailed through minefields, under constant threat from Soviet submarines. The Baltic, once a peaceful sea, had become a graveyard. Every ripple of water could hide a periscope. Every glint of light could mean death. Only a week after the Wilhelm Gustloff went down, tragedy struck again. On February 10, 1945, the German liner General von Steuben, a hospital ship carrying over 4,000 wounded soldiers and medical personnel, left Pillau bound for Kiel. Her decks were crowded with stretchers. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, many missing limbs, their faces pale under flickering lanterns. Nurses moved quietly among them, whispering prayers. The night was calm. The sea was smooth as glass. But beneath that glass waited the same hunter, the Soviet submarine S-13, still commanded by Captain Marinesko. Just after midnight, 2 torpedoes streaked toward the ship. Moments later, a blinding explosion ripped through the hull. Fire burst from the portholes, and screams filled the air. Within minutes, the General von Steuben was gone. Out of thousands aboard, only 300 survived. Marinesko's name would become both feared and cursed. In less than 2 weeks, his submarine had sent more than 14,000 souls to the bottom of the sea. The Soviet Union hailed him as a hero decades later, but in 1945, few even knew his name. For the Germans fleeing west, he was the invisible monster in the deep, silent, patient, merciless. Still, the evacuation continued. Thousands more poured into the ports of Danzig, Gotenhafen, and Halle. Families torn apart by war now huddled together on the decks of ships that looked like floating ruins. The decks were slick with ice, the air thick with smoke and fear. Everywhere the same sound: engines coughing, chains clanking, babies crying. In early April 1945, tragedy struck yet again. The Goya, a cargo ship turned transport, departed from Hela carrying an estimated 7,000 refugees, soldiers, women, children. The ship moved through the darkness, escorted by small patrol boats. The passengers could hear artillery in the distance. The Red Army was only days away. At 11:52 p.m., Soviet submarine L-3, commanded by Captain Konstantin Grishchenko, fired 2 torpedoes. The Goya was hit amidships. The explosion tore her apart in seconds. She sank in less than 7 minutes. Only 183 survived. Over 6,800 men, women, and children vanished into the night. The Baltic had become a black maw, swallowing ship after ship. For many sailors, superstition took hold. They began to call it the convoy of ghosts. Every time they passed through the frozen sea, they imagined the voices of the drowned whispering beneath the waves. One German destroyer captain later wrote, "You could hear them at night. The wind carried the cries across the water. We told ourselves it was only the sea, but deep down we knew." By March, Donitz's naval command had evacuated more than 1 million people, but the price was unbearable. The harbours were under constant air attack. In Gdynia, bombs fell among the refugees waiting to board, killing hundreds. Yet still they came. Old women pushing carts, children dragging broken suitcases, soldiers limping on crutches. All desperate for one thing: a place on a ship. Among them were entire families who had lost everything: their homes, their fathers, their futures. They clung to one another as they watched ships disappear into the fog, praying that their own would not meet the same fate. By April, as Soviet forces reached the Baltic coast, the last convoys left under fire. German ships were hit by bombs as they departed, the sea around them boiling with explosions. The air smelled of cordite and salt. The water itself seemed alive with wreckage: wood, lifeboats, oil, bodies. In the darkness, one could see the faint silhouettes of ships burning on the horizon. The sky glowed orange, and the smoke merged with low clouds. It looked as if the sea itself was on fire. To those who survived, Operation Hannibal no longer felt like an evacuation. It felt like a curse. Each mile west was paid for with the lives of thousands. Each successful voyage carried with it the ghosts of those who had not made it. And yet, the ships kept coming, because there was no other choice. By April 1945, the Baltic Sea had become the last artery of a dying empire. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, Berlin was encircled, and the eastern provinces of Germany, East Prussia, Pomerania, and Danzig were being erased from the map under the advancing Red Army. But on the frozen waters between Hela and Lübeck, the Kriegsmarine still fought, not for victory, but for survival. Every day, ships groaned out of the ruined ports, their decks packed beyond imagination. The docks were a scene from another world: soldiers bleeding into the snow, horses shot to clear the way, civilians clawing for space on the next ship. In Gotenhafen, the air reeked of smoke, diesel, and death. The Baltic wind carried the cries of those left behind. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now operating from his bunker in Plön, gave orders with trembling hands. He knew the war was lost, but he refused to abandon the refugees. "We must save as many as possible," he told his officers. "Every life matters now." From January to May, his navy had moved more than 2 million people, soldiers, wounded, civilians, across a sea infested with submarines and mines. It was an operation of staggering scale and desperation. Each voyage was a gamble with death, and yet ships continued to sail even as the Reich disintegrated around them. In the ports, order had collapsed. The SS guarded the last fuel supplies, shooting anyone who tried to board without papers. Women fainted in the cold. Children vanished in the crowds. The sound of artillery grew louder each day. As the front approached, the city of Danzig burned. At night the sky flickered with fire from the east, red arcs of shells and burning villages lighting the horizon. The sea reflected it all, turning the ice crimson. From a distance it looked like the Baltic itself was bleeding. Among the ships sailing out was the Deutschland, once a grand passenger liner, now packed with refugees and wounded soldiers. Her captain, a man named Paul Burmeister, had orders to reach Copenhagen through the mined waters. On board, people prayed as the engines coughed to life. There was no silence, only the metallic groan of steel under strain and the endless, low moan of wind. They passed through fields of wreckage, the remains of ships already lost. Floating doors, life jackets, even toys drifted by. A nurse wrote later in her diary, "The sea was full of faces. Every wave carried someone. We dared not look too closely." Further west, the port of Halle became the last German stronghold on the Baltic. Tens of thousands crowded onto the narrow peninsula, waiting for rescue under artillery fire. The ground shook with explosions. Every day, ships arrived, loaded, and left again, sometimes hit before they reached open sea. The Kriegsmarine's smaller vessels, minesweepers, tugs, and U-boats, took on passengers too, even though they were never meant for it. Submarines carried civilians in their narrow corridors, the air thick and foul. The crews shared their food and blankets. Some refused to leave refugees behind even when it risked their own lives. Despite everything, the operation became an act of defiance, a last flicker of humanity amid ruin. German sailors who had spent years fighting for Hitler now found themselves saving women and children from the same war they had helped create. They worked without rest, pulling the frozen and the frightened from the water, knowing that many would not survive the night. On May 2nd, 1945, as Berlin fell and Hitler lay dead in his bunker, the last ships of Operation Hannibal sailed. Among them were the Cap Arcona and Thielbeck, massive liners loaded not with refugees, but with concentration camp prisoners being evacuated by the SS. None of them knew what awaited. Off the coast of Lübeck, British aircraft spotted the ships. Believing them to be carrying escaping SS officers, the planes attacked. The sky filled with fire. Rockets struck the decks, and within minutes both ships were burning. Thousands of prisoners trapped below deck were incinerated or drowned. The sea boiled black with oil and bodies. Over 7,000 more lives were lost, a final horror in a war already drowning in death. When the smoke cleared, the Baltic was silent once more. The wind carried only the faint crackle of burning wrecks and the cries of survivors clinging to debris. Operation Hannibal was ending, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Of the thousands of ships that had sailed, many now lay on the seabed. The water was filled with ghosts, the dead from the Gustloff, the Steuben, the Goya, the Cap Arcona, and countless nameless vessels. For those who reached the west, there was no celebration. They were safe, yes, but homeless, broken, and haunted. Behind them, their homeland was gone. Ahead of them, only uncertainty. The Baltic Sea had been their lifeline and their grave. The war ended not with victory, but with silence. The guns ceased, the skies cleared, and what remained of Germany lay in ruins. For the survivors of Operation Hannibal, the sound of the sea would never again bring comfort. It whispered of ghosts, of frozen nights, sinking ships, and the screams that still echoed beneath the waves. In the weeks after surrender, the Baltic was quiet. The Allied forces now controlled the ports, and the once mighty Kriegsmarine lay scuttled or surrendered. The evacuation had saved over 2 million lives, but at a cost that defied comprehension, More than 30,000 men, women, and children had drowned in those bitter months. Yet few spoke of it. The world was too exhausted to hear. The Wilhelm Gustloff, the General von Steuben, the Goya, each name was a wound. But in post-war Europe, those wounds were buried beneath guilt, ruin, and politics. The victors wrote the history, and the suffering of German civilians, even innocent ones, was a story no one wanted to tell. The survivors faded into silence. Some settled in the West, trying to rebuild shattered lives. Others never spoke of what they had seen. Mothers who had lost children, sailors who had pulled lifeless bodies from the freezing sea. They carried the memories like shadows, too painful to share. In the years that followed, the Baltic swallowed its dead without a trace. The sea became their grave, and the wrecks their tombs. Divers who later descended to the resting places of those ships described a haunting sight: corridors filled with shoes, rusting cribs, and the outlines of lives frozen in time. On the Gustloff's decks, porcelain cups still rested where they fell. It was as if time itself had stopped at 9:16 p.m. on that January night. But even the dead were not left in peace. During the Cold War, both East and West Germany avoided the subject of Operation Hannibal. In the East, under Soviet control, it was forbidden to speak of the Soviet submarine attacks. In the West, it was seen as politically dangerous, a story that risked shifting sympathy toward the defeated enemy. And so, history turned away. For decades, the world knew only the names Titanic and Lusitania when it came to maritime tragedy. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the deadliest disaster in the history of the sea, remained almost unknown. It wasn't until the 1980s that fragments of truth began to re-emerge. Survivors spoke at last, their voices trembling as they recalled the cold, the darkness, and the faces of those left behind. Journalists and historians uncovered logs, diaries, and forgotten naval records. The story that had been buried under ice and silence began to thaw. One of them was Heinz Schön, a young steward who had survived the sinking of the Gustloff. For decades he collected testimonies, documents, and artifacts, determined that the world would not forget. They must be remembered, he said. They were not soldiers. They were people. His words echoed what so many had felt but never said: that war does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. In the end, all are devoured by the same storm. Today, the Baltic remains calm. The sea that once boiled with fire and death now rests under endless grey skies. But beneath those quiet waters lie thousands of souls, entire families, their stories untold. The wrecks still rest there, sealed in the cold darkness, guarded by silt and silence. Occasionally, fishermen still find fragments in their nets: a child's shoe, a cup, a piece of uniform, a ring with a name worn smooth by salt. Each one is a whisper from that frozen exodus, a reminder of a chapter the world tried to forget. Operation Hannibal was more than an evacuation. It was a moment when the line between hope and despair vanished, when a dying nation tried to save what was left of its people amid the ashes of its own creation. It was tragedy, redemption, and futility intertwined. When Admiral Dönitz heard that Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered, he reportedly stood silent for a long time. Then he ordered his remaining ships to cease fire and to continue evacuating refugees until the very last moment. Even as the Reich died, he refused to abandon those still on the Baltic. The final evacuation ships docked at Kiel and Flensburg in early May 1945. The war was over. The refugees stumbled ashore, ragged, starved, and numb. Behind them, the Baltic stretched into the horizon, calm and silver in the morning light. Somewhere out there, their homes lay in ruins, and the sea held the faces of those who would never return. And then came the silence. For years that silence lasted, a silence of shame, grief, and forgotten memory. But history cannot remain buried forever. Today, the story of Operation Hannibal is finally told, not to glorify, not to excuse, but to remember. Because in the end, every war leaves ghosts, and they do not rest until someone speaks their names. Beneath the cold waters of the Baltic, they are still there, thousands upon thousands, waiting. The waves whisper their story still. The story of the forgotten Titanic of Germany. The story of Operation Hannibal.